Not that long ago, we published a video talking about some of the myths that people have believed regarding the Soviet Union. It has proven to be a very popular video, and many people have asked for a follow-up, which we expected since we told you it was going to be 10 myths and we only presented the first 5. I'm your host David, and today we are going to talk about another 5 myths about the USSR which have been popular outside of the Soviet Union. This is the Cold War. The best way to tell myth from reality is by applying critical thinking skills, and the sponsor of this video will help you do just that. Brilliant is a learning platform that helps you develop and practice your creative problem-solving skills by using interactive learning. There are courses for any ability and knowledge level, and each problem comes from a step-by-step solution that helps you understand the reasoning behind each step. Brilliant doesn't focus on memorizing an answer, but instead teaches you to think using logic and problem solving. My favorite course was, naturally, math history, but Brilliant has a wide variety of courses, and you don't need to be a math whiz to learn from every one of them, as Brilliant makes it easy. For instance, I use Brilliant to learn more about cryptocurrency. Brilliant is making it fun even for non-STEM people like me, and I know that you guys will find it very useful. Join the millions of people already learning on Brilliant with a special offer just for listeners. Head to brilliant.org/coldwar to get started for free with Brilliant's interactive lessons. The first 200 listeners will also get 20% off an annual membership. Okay, let's start with the myth or misconception that Soviet citizens were not allowed to leave the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was undoubtedly a closed country with restrictive travel regulations. It was also very conscientious of its perceived reputation abroad and looked to control what its citizens might say about the country, which could present a negative image. What this meant, however, was that it was difficult to travel abroad, but by no means impossible. In fact, thousands and eventually millions of Soviet citizens would travel abroad every year. So let's break this down a little. Even from the very early days of the USSR, hundreds, if not thousands, of Soviet citizens worked abroad as members of diplomatic and trade missions to various countries around the world. In addition, scientists, engineers, athletes, and artists would also travel, representing the Soviet Union under the watchful gaze of members of the Soviet intelligence services. But beyond this, with very few exceptions, ordinary citizens had very little opportunity to travel. But, like with so many things, rapid changes began after Stalin died. Starting from 1955, Intourist was allowed to start organizing tourist travel abroad. Friendly socialist states like Bulgaria, East Germany, and Poland were popular travel destinations, but due to its proximity and the friendly relations enjoyed between the two nations, Finland was also a popular destination. Other non-socialist destinations included places like India, which, like Finland, was on good terms with Moscow. And over time, the choice in destinations increased. In 1963, there were 106 approved nations to visit, while by 1980, this had increased to 142. Of course, we should point out that countries could also be removed depending on the status of their political relationship with the USSR. Travel to Yugoslavia, Syria, and Lebanon, for example, was discontinued in 1956 as their relationships to Moscow deteriorated. Countries could be added back if relations improved. Okay then, so what kind of numbers are we talking about? Well, according to official statistics, in 1956, 561,000 Soviet citizens traveled abroad, and the number only climbed from there. 730,000 in 1960, 1.2 million in 1965, 2.5 million in 1975, and almost 4.5 million Soviet citizens traveled abroad in 1985. We will point out that this is an aggregate number and doesn't indicate how many people traveled for work versus traveling as a tourist, but the numbers remain very clear. Soviet citizens could and did travel abroad. But this doesn't mean it was easy. After all, while 4.5 million people might seem like a lot, the population of the Soviet Union in 1985 was about 275 million, so yeah. Soviet citizens needed multiple levels of permission in order to travel. This included signed authorization from a person's director of work or study, by the secretary of the local branch of the party and by the secretary of the local branch of the person's trade union. Once these were obtained, the application to travel needed to be debated and approved by both the local party committee and then the district party committee. Only once all of this had happened could the application be sent to the KGB so that a full background investigation could be conducted. Once all of these hurdles had been cleared, then and only then could a person buy a tour through the Intourist or Sputnik travel agencies. The trip would then be conducted as part of a group, which included a translator who was almost definitely a not-so-undercover KGB agent. This limited foreign travel, even to ideologically friendly nations, to only the most politically reliable, and even then, the individual couldn't have relatives living abroad. So this obviously disproves the myth that Soviet citizens couldn't travel abroad, but does clearly show that travel was reserved to a select non-threatening few. Now, another pervasive myth that, despite plenty of information to the contrary being available, continues to exist is that the Soviet Union was totally dominant over its satellite states in East and Central Europe and dictated all of their policies. I've seen people even suggest that the satellite states were no different than the republics of the USSR, and that if Bulgaria or Poland had been annexed, there would have been very little difference. Except none of this is true. Yes, the Soviet Union did exercise broad, high-level control over the Warsaw Pact nations, even staging several military interventions to prevent a total loss of control, and there was certainly a strong economic influence that the Soviet Union could wield, but at the end of the day, each of the nations in the East Bloc were independent and could, and did, make independent decisions. These decisions naturally were being made by men who knew it would be in their best interest to not really anger the Soviet Union, as not only were the economies of these countries intrinsically linked to Moscow, but their own personal power was also. Now, Bulgaria was likely the country that acted the most in lockstep with the Soviet Union, considered by many to be the most loyal. That being said, however, although Bulgaria was politically aligned to Moscow, in the global cultural sphere, Bulgaria pursued its own independent practices, fostering cultural exchanges and programs around the world, including the Global South. For those interested, I recommend reading The Cold War from the Margins by Teodora Dragostinova, an excellent exploration of this topic. Hungary, on the other hand, made a very public attempt to break away from Moscow's orbit in 1956, one which was very publicly crushed. But the violent suppression of Hungary created a huge amount of animosity towards the Soviet Union, which Moscow was well aware of. This actually gave Budapest more leverage to enact some reforms which were neither liked nor particularly approved of by Moscow, but tolerated in order to maintain a pacific Hungary. The initial refusal of Hungary to participate in the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia resulted in Moscow granting some further economic freedoms, which led to Kadar to implement his new economic mechanism, some limited market economy mechanisms, which boosted both the Hungarian economy as well as living standards. Similarly, in Czechoslovakia during the normalization period, Moscow was convinced not to punish Dubček, but rather just send him away as the ambassador to Turkey. In the GDR, Walter Ulbricht was successful for a long time in ensuring that no rapprochement between the Warsaw Pact nations and West Germany occurred, as the East Germans feared being isolated. Poland had seen a small rebellion diffused in 1956 by the granting of more Polish autonomy from the Soviets, and of course in the 1980s sought to avoid a military invasion of Poland by the USSR as demonstrations and protests swept the country. And then there was Romania. Romania was the seeming odd man out. In 1963, it blocked Mongolian membership to the Warsaw Pact. It refused to take part in the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia. It maintained a cordial relationship with China, including a 1971 state visit by Ceausescu to Beijing. Romania had a track record of voting differently on the international stage than their supposed masters in Moscow. Although it's been argued that Romania's less than strategic geographic position made Moscow more tolerant of dissent since it didn't share any borders with the capitalist enemies, Romania certainly was no mere puppet of the Soviet Union. Our third myth is actually less of a myth and more of a widespread misconception or misunderstanding. It's also one that many of you watching there are already aware of, but we wanted to include for those who may not know. The KGB was not the only major intelligence agency in the Soviet Union. Between the hundreds of spy movies and spy novels that have been produced, almost all of us have heard of the world's primary intelligence organizations: the CIA, Mossad, MI6, the HVA, the DGSE, and of course the KGB. All of those played significant roles throughout the Cold War. But there is another Soviet intelligence organization which is often overlooked despite its own significant role in the Cold War, the GRU. The main intelligence administration was the Military Intelligence Service, operating under the direction of the Ministry of Defense. It was engaged in military espionage, recruitment of foreign agents in the West, and carried out diversion and sabotage operations against the potential targets of the USSR. The GRU was primarily focused on intelligence gathering and countering military threats, largely leaving both counterintelligence and surveillance of Soviet citizens to the KGB. So the GRU's existence was not well publicized and remained fairly under wraps until the 1978 defection of Major Vladimir Rezun, who then began publishing books under the pseudonym Viktor Suvorov, including an autobiography titled Aquarium, detailing the work of the GRU, including its recruitment processes, as well as its overseas operations. Suvorov's work brought the GRU more into the public eye, but as far as public perception went, was still second fiddle to the KGB. So what did the GRU get up to? Well, it's a substantial list. They were behind the operations that became known as the Profumo Affair, which caused the fall of Prime Minister Harold Macmillan in 1964. It was GRU troops who captured Hafizullah Amin's palace in Kabul in 1979, paving the way for the Soviet-Afghan War through the 1980s, and it was through GRU back channels that dialogue between the United States and the Soviet Union began during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, what was the difference between the KGB and the GRU? Well, it came down to what they were responsible for, with the differences being best explained through a few examples. Let's take Alexander Solzhenitsyn's seminal work, The Gulag Archipelago. The publication of the book was a disaster for the KGB. It painted a terrible picture to the world abroad and hurt the confidence of Soviet citizens in their own system. But for the GRU, the book wasn't really a big deal. Its publication didn't create or impact any immediate military or espionage threats to the Soviet Union. On the flip side, however, the KGB and the GRU's attitude towards China were very different. The KGB in general didn't view China as a major threat because China was generally less developed and its citizens living in generally worse conditions than the Soviet Union. No significant ideological threat was posed, especially since both countries shared a common-ish ideology. But for the GRU, China was a huge issue. With a border that was over 11,000 kilometers long, it was extremely difficult to fully protect and was viewed as a major source of potential military diversions and sabotage. Okay, next myth. The popular perception of the Soviet Union is that it was an oppressive and totalitarian state. That's not the myth, though. It absolutely was an oppressive and totalitarian state. And the fact remains that since the Bolshevik victory in the Russian Civil War, there existed no major organized opposition to the communist order until the eve of the Soviet collapse. So the myth that has developed as a result is that the Soviet people never protested or raised their voices against injustices they experienced. They absolutely did. To outline just a few of these protests, in 1956, Georgians in the Republic capital of Tbilisi poured into the street, objecting to Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin. The demonstrations went on for several days before the authorities used force to suppress and disperse the people. Anywhere between 22 and several hundred people were killed, depending on the sources cited. In 1958, ethnic Russians in the Chechen city of Grozny gathered, demanding more rights than Chechens who were returning from their forced exile in Siberia and the East. The authorities largely let the demonstrations continue unhindered until the crowds captured and began looting the railway station and post office, at which time Soviet authorities stepped in and dispersed the crowds. In 1961, a workers' demonstration protesting price hikes and poor working conditions in the city of Novocherkassk was forcibly broken up, resulting in the deaths of many. 1965 saw a gathering of over 100,000 Armenians in the city of Yerevan, demanding the recognition of the Armenian genocide by the Soviet government, as well as the annexation of territory that had been ceded by Turkey to Armenia in the Treaty of Sèvres. They got a memorial marking the genocide. In 1968, 8 people gathered in Krasnaya Ploshad, Red Square, to conduct a sit-in protest against the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia. They were quickly surrounded, beaten, and arrested by security men. In 1972, following the self-immolation death of a 19-year-old Lithuanian student in the city of Kaunas, himself protesting Soviet occupation, protests broke out. Riots and small-scale violence broke out after people were denied the opportunity to attend the funeral, and a larger demonstration involving up to 3,000 people took place. This was forcibly broken up by the security services, with more than a few injuries occurring. In 1978, massive demonstrations broke out in Tbilisi as Georgians demanded the reinstatement of the Georgian language as the primary language of the republic. The protesters, in a rare victory, won their point and got what they wanted, with the authorities becoming more fearful of using brute force on their own people. Okay, so you can see it. Protests and demonstrations did happen in the Soviet Union. They may not have been part of a larger, broader organized opposition, nor were they sustained or carried on once the government reaction had been made, but they did happen. The Soviet people were not necessarily meek or cowed and would react when provoked, even suffering the almost inevitable retributions by the state as a result. So, the last myth we're going to look at is one that has a real persistence and is very popular in discussions of the Soviet Union. That is the myth of constant shortages, rationing, and famine. While it's true that all of these things occurred at various times in Soviet history, it's not true that they were pervasive through the entire history of the USSR. Okay, so there were 3 famines in Soviet history, during the Civil War, during the early 1930s, and then in 1947. These famines led to the deaths of millions, but between 1948 and 1991, no further famines occurred. There were limits to the food supply, certainly, with limited or restricted choices, and imports often being necessary, but at the end of the day, the people didn't starve. Despite what the memes will tell you, there was food. Now, what about shortages? Yep, they were a thing. They stemmed from pricing being set centrally, but not being allowed to change, even as citizens' wages increased over time. The resulting hidden inflation that occurred resulted in fewer goods being produced in order to cover the costs of rising wages. Shortages also came from artificially inflated production reports made to satisfy central planners and advance the careers of ambitious bosses. So where's the myth? Well, it's that shortages were always there. It wasn't until the 1970s that they became more common and then endemic by the 1980s. But it's this image of long lines and empty shelves in the 1980s that's often been seared into the minds of many and then imprinted across the entirety of Soviet history. And that then leads to rationing. Rationing in the post-war Soviet Union was only introduced in the 1980s, the result of the just mentioned shortages. It wasn't deemed necessary before that time. So while rationing, shortages, and even famine were a part of Soviet history, they were very much specific to particular periods of time and not the entirety of the USSR's existence. And there you go, another 5 myths surrounding the Soviet Union. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have formed a second rival organization with some duplicated tasks, but really more focused on the external military activities of other YouTube channels, with a primary focus on disrupting viewers' abilities to press the bell buttons of those channels, but guaranteeing the ability to press our button. Press the button. Press the button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, your financial support would be greatly appreciated via patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. This is the Cold War channel, and as we think about the Cold War, I will leave you with the words of JFK. In the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we are all inhabitants of this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal.